We're going to have a look at the life of Naomi and hopefully learn some lessons, some powerful lessons from her struggles, from the things that she suffered, from the twists and turns that was in her walk in the truth. And God willing, in 2 weeks' time, we'll then take a closer look at Ruth. It's an incredible story. I think we probably say that a lot about a lot of stories in the Bible. This one is amazing in many ways, and hopefully as we go through I can do it somewhat justice. But here we have two examples of faithful women, two very different women, two different individuals who God worked with and blessed them both very much. The story of Naomi is quite an emotional story. At times it's a very sad story, as she has to deal with tragedy. It seems like one tragedy after another in her life, until Naomi gets to a point where she loses all kind of hope. And Naomi gets to a point, which we'll read, where she feels that the only place that she can see her God is in the tragedies that she keeps suffering. That's the only place that she can see the existence of her God. And she concludes that God's hand is against her. The lesson that we'll hopefully see tonight coming out of the life of Naomi is that of persistence and perseverance with her God. Above all else, I believe that was her greatest quality. Despite suffering and facing so much pain and suffering, she never abandons her God. She may at times, as we'll see, lose hope in what God is doing, and she may at times not understand why God is working in the way that He's working. But she never turns her back on her God. And God works with this woman in incredible ways, as we will see. Now, I don't believe the story of Naomi is primarily a story about divine judgment because of the poor decisions that she makes. I don't think that's the primary purpose and what the Scripture is trying to tell us in this story. The Scripture is showing us, I believe, how God works with an individual's life, how God works within a believer's life through all the ups and downs, through all the twists and turns, the good decisions that we make and the poor decisions that we make. And I'm sure that you will all agree that our walk is not a smooth walk. At times it's a very messy walk, isn't it, in the truth? And that walk, or along that walk, we no doubt have times where we make good decisions. We make decisions where God is at the very base of those decisions that we make. He's right in the middle of them. But all of us at times, we make decisions that are unwise and that don't include God. Our walk in the truth has many twists and turns, it has ups and downs. But the power of the story of Naomi is that our God is always there working for our eternal salvation. He is always there through the good times, but even more so through the bad times, through the dark times, the times where we feel like we're at our weakest. God will continue to work with us as long as we stay with Him, as long as we persevere with our God. Now, if there was one verse in Scripture that I think summarises the life of Naomi and the story of Naomi, it's this one in Romans 8, verse 28, a verse we all know so well. And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to His purpose. Right throughout the ups and downs of Naomi's life, God was there working in this life for her ultimate good. But there were times that even Naomi could not see that. At times she didn't know if her God was for her or whether her God was against her. At times in our lives, I'm sure we all feel that way, where it's hard to understand how God is shaping our lives. It's hard to understand the things that are brought into our lives, how they could be working to our ultimate good. Sometimes things happen to us where we think, what good could possibly come from this? Now, we're all very good as individuals at planning and having visions for how our life will go. whether that's our career or whether that's our life in the truth or our family life. We all make plans and we have visions as to how we want things to be. But how often does the reality turn out to be so different to what we had in mind? Even when something bad might happen to us, it's even natural for us to then start predicting how God is going to flip that around and how God is actually going to bring something good out of that. An example might be when we lose our job. If we lose our job, we might think, well, obviously God has got a better job in mind for me, a job that has more pay, that I don't have to work as many hours. That's how God is going to turn this out to my good. That's how he's working in my life. But what this story shows to us is that God often works in ways, and he often puts circumstances in our lives that we could never predict. We may have a vision or an expectation as to how things might work out, but often God has something completely different in mind, just like he did for Naomi. And that can be difficult for us, because when we can't see how or why God is working in a particular way, it requires us to have tremendous trust and tremendous faith. We need to trust that all things work together for good to them that love God. And that is hopefully the powerful lesson that we'll see come out of this life, this story of Naomi. But before we dive into it, let's just look at some of the background, like some of the context of the book of Ruth. Verse 1 tells us, "Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled." So the book of Ruth takes place in the time of the judges, after the children of Israel had entered the promised land, under the direction of Joshua. We don't know when exactly the book of Ruth is placed within the time of the judges. We don't know exactly who the author is, but we know that it wasn't a very good time in the history of Israel. It wasn't a very good time at all. The very last verse of the book of Judges, if you just look up, verse 25 of Judges 21, we read, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes." Spiritually, this wasn't a good time in Israel's history, as this verse indicates. People were going against the commandments, the laws that God had put in place. They were making decisions based on what was best for them in their lives, and they weren't considering God in those decisions. And this was a cycle that repeated itself over and over again during the Judges. We know that the people would rebel against God, and then they would get themselves into all manner of trouble at the hands of the nations around them, and then they would cry out to their God, and then God would send a judge, and they would rescue his people. And this cycle would go around and around and around again. Back in verse 1 of Ruth, we read that there was a famine in the land. "And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons." So there was a famine in Bethlehem where Naomi and Elimelech and their 2 boys lived. And it's interesting that Bethlehem, well, the name Bethlehem means house of bread. And in the house of bread there was no bread left. The famine was a sign of God's displeasure at his people. And we're told that in Leviticus. Well, we've got that up on the screen. Leviticus 26, verse 3 and 4, we read, "If you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments and do them, then I will give you rain in due season, and the land shall yield her increase, and the trees of the field shall yield fruit." So God says that if you stay in my ways, I will bless your crops. And the extension of that is if you depart from my ways, then famine would be a result. And that is what we have here. We have a time when men and women were pleasing themselves rather than their God, and God has stopped the rain from falling as a sign of his displeasure. And there's no longer any bread in the house of bread. So in this very context, the book of Ruth then zooms in, puts the microscope on one particular family living in that time, to look at the decisions that this family makes in this context. And it's very easy, I think, to pass over the fact that this would have been such a difficult time for Naomi and Elimelech. trying to raise a God-fearing family in this place at this time and dealing with a famine. Now, here's just some meaning of names. So Elimelech means my God is king. Naomi, pleasant. We'll have a look a little bit more about the name of Naomi a bit later on. Then we have these two boys, Mahlon and Chilion. So Mahlon means to be weak, sick, sickly, and Chilion means frail. Fancy naming your two boys weak and frail, or sickly. But what I think this reflects, and a lot of opinions would say that this is possibly, or very likely, a reflection of the effects of the famine that would have had on these children. There wasn't much food and they were weak and frail as a result. And that just gives a small insight into the actual difficulties that families would go through when there was a famine. Imagine raising your kids at that time. When I was thinking of this, I struggled. I was trying to think of a time when I'd actually been hungry for a period of time, for any length of time. And I struggled to think of a time when I actually was really hungry, when I didn't have, food at least available to me in close proximity. I've always just had food there. The closest thing I could think of was when I was younger, and I remember my older sister Karen, who she decided to raise money by doing what was called a 40-hour famine. And I remember she did this one weekend, but my recollection of that was that when she was doing this 40-hour famine, one of the rules stated, and I'm not sure if she was bending the rules or not, but one of the rules stated that you could have barley sugars. But what Karen did, I just remember her just sucking back barley sugar after barley sugar after barley sugar. So I'm not sure it was exactly the perfect famine-like conditions when she did this 40-hour famine. And then I remember when the famine finished, when her 40 hours finished, as a family to celebrate, we all went out and just had a huge banquet lunch. So it was probably hardly a famine experience. But that's the closest thing that I've come to a famine. But I think it's easy to take this for granted in a place that we live in Australia like we do. And I just take for granted being able to provide food for Theo. And he very rarely goes hungry. I can guarantee you, very rarely goes hungry. And if he does, he definitely makes you know, or lets you know that he's hungry. But just imagine for a moment being a parent and seeing your children going hungry because there wasn't enough food. That would be like torture. Not being able to provide for your kids who are starving, and you can see the physical effects of that famine on your children. Terrible, terrible conditions that these people lived in. That is what Naomi and Elimelech were facing with in their lives. And so they make this decision to leave. We read, "And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. They leave Bethlehem and they move to Moab, which was situated on the east side of Jordan. And if you were sitting down and you were making a list of all the best places you could go, if you were going to leave, you're going to make a list of the best places you could go, it is hard to imagine that Moab would have been right at the top of that list. The origins of Moab, there's a lot of history with Moab. The origins of Moab go right back to Genesis 19, where Lot's daughter got him drunk and they had an incestuous relationship, and she had a son and called him Moab. That's the start of Moab. In Numbers 15, we won't turn it up, Numbers 25, we read there where the sons of God committed fornication with the women of Moab. These women invited the children of Israel to come and worship their idols, to take part in idolatry. That day, as a result of that incident, God sent a plague and 24,000 people lost their lives in that incident. Now, when the children of Israel were making their journey out of Egypt through the wilderness, and they came near where Moab was, we know that the Moabites would not allow them to go into their land. They wouldn't allow them to pass through there. And their king at the time, Balak, hired Balaam to curse the Israelites. There was so much history between the children of Israel and Moab. It's a strange decision. Now, we read this in Deuteronomy. This just shows the extent of the separation that was there between God's people and Moab. Deuteronomy 23, verse 3 and 4. We read, "An Ammonite or Moabite shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation shall they not enter into the congregation of the Lord forever, because they met you not with bread and with water in the way, when ye came forth out of Egypt. And because they hired against thee Balaam, the son of Beor of Pethor of Mesopotamia, to curse thee." There was a lot of history between the Moabites and God's people. They were the enemies of Israel in many ways. They'd been cut off and they were not welcome into God's land, into the congregation of the Lord. It was a place known for idolatry, for sexual immorality, for pagan worship. It was not a nice place at all. And we're told that a certain man of Bethlehem, along with his wife Naomi, take their family to live in this place in order to escape this famine. Why would they choose Moab, of all places to go, given their history? It's hard to answer. And there are many people who have opinions on this. I believe, at the very least, that it shows the desperate nature of the situation that they were in as a family. They were in a famine, which had clearly been sent by God, and there wasn't enough food. Their kids were weak, they were frail, and they didn't know when it was going to rain again. They didn't know. So they make this journey to Moab. Maybe they had very few options on the table. Maybe there wasn't many places they could go within close enough proximity for this family to travel to. But were they turning their backs on God? Again, there's much written and argued about the decision that Elimelech makes as to whether he was turning his back on God. But I don't think it was as clear-cut as that, personally, and I'd be interested to hear your opinions afterwards. I don't think this would have been an easy decision to make at all. It'd be a terribly tough decision to make. Was it the right decision? Well, probably not. It was a decision that no doubt Naomi would come to regret so much, as we will see in a moment. But as I said at the outset, our walk in the truth is one that has many twists and turns. It's made up of wise decisions, and it's made up of many, many poor decisions. But the power of this story will be in how God works this decision, or works with this decision, to bring about incredible blessings for Naomi, but also blessings, really, that extends far beyond Naomi. But as a family, I believe that they sat down and they came up with a plan. And we get an insight into that plan when we read the word sojourn in verse 1. The plan was that this was going to be a temporary trip. It was going to be a temporary thing for them to go to Moab, to get some food, to stay there for a little while, and then to come back. That was what the intention was. It's something that Abraham had done previously when there was a famine in the land, and he went down to Egypt for a period of time to sojourn in Egypt while the famine was on. And then Isaac did a similar thing as well when he went and sojourned during a period of famine. The plan would be to sojourn in Moab. But see at the end of verse 2, we read there that, "And they came into the country of Moab and continued there." Now that's seems like quite an odd phrase, "continued there." And I was reading this passage in all these different translations, try and understand what it kind of meant. And one translation stood out, and that was the NET, which says that they settled there. Now, it's clearly a tough little section to translate because there's a lot of different ideas and different translations that come from that phrase. But the sense that you get is that by the end of verse 2, they had gone past the point of sojourning. This had gone past the point of a temporary stay, and they had settled. They'd become comfortable in the land of Moab. And maybe it was at this point that they'd slowly and gradually started to drift apart from their God. They'd made the original decision to sojourn, but gradually, bit by bit, it seems that they have drifted and they had now settled in this land of Moab. Isn't that so easy for us to do in our lives? We can just drift bit by bit without really even knowing, without making a conscious decision. It's a bit like when you go for a swim in the ocean and there's that current in the ocean, and as you're swimming there, you don't even notice it, but that current is slowly taking you as you swim. And then you look at the beach and you try and find where your stuff is and your towels are, and it's like way over there, and you think, wow, I didn't realise that I'd moved so far. And that can be what our relationship is like sometimes with our God. We don't necessarily make a conscious decision to abandon our God, but we can easily drift bit by bit. Before we know it, we look at the distance between ourselves and our God and we can think, how have I got this far away? And I think there's a lesson there for us in this family when they move to Moab. But what happens to Naomi next is truly tragic. Truly tragic. Between verses 3 and 5, Naomi takes hit after hit. Let's just read these verses. Try and take it in. Read, and Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. And they took them wives of the women of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they dwelled there about 10 years. And Mahlon and Chilion died also, both of them. And the woman was left of her 2 sons and her husband. Now let's just try and take that in. Here is Naomi with her family in a foreign country, a country that wasn't a particularly nice place to be living, and her husband unexpectedly dies. Now she's left by herself. She's there by herself with her boys, without her husband in this land. And they go, these boys, and they marry women from Moab. And that would have been a tragedy for Naomi. An absolute tragedy to see her boys marry women from Moab, especially with the history of the women from Moab, her 2 boys doing this. And it would have been so hard for her to take. And then after 10 years, there was still no kids. There was no kids. They hadn't had children. And after 10 years of being married in those times and there was no kids, it's now starting to look very, very likely like these girls can't have kids. There's no children, there's no seed to carry on their line. And then the final blow, her 2 boys die. We don't know how they died, but they're gone. And at the end of verse 5, we read the very sorry state that Naomi now finds herself in. And the woman was left of her 2 sons and her husband. She was left alone. Everything she had as she left Bethlehem to sojourn in the land of Moab was gone. And she was left with 2 daughters-in-law from Moab who appeared to be barren. Things certainly didn't go to plan. That was not what Naomi had in mind when she made the decision to sojourn in the land of Moab. In a short space of time, she'd gone from having a loving family, 2 boys who could carry on the family line, that carry on the family's inheritance, and now it's all been taken away. And all that she's left with is daughters-in-law from all places, from Moab. Sometimes our lives take us in a direction that we could never, ever imagine. As I mentioned at the outset, we all tend to make plans and have a vision for how things are going to go in our lives and how things are going to work themselves out in our life. But how often does it turn out to be so different to that, the reality of our lives and where we find ourselves? Naomi now had nothing. And let's just consider the predicament of Naomi at this point. She now carries around with her the heartbreak every day of having lost her husband and her 2 boys. And she would have no doubt have revisited that decision that she made, along with Elimelech, to move to Moab, she would have revisited that in her mind over and over again. She would have agonised over that decision. And no doubt at times she would have felt so responsible for what had gone on. Yes, we didn't have food. Yes, we were hungry, but we had each other. Why did we move to this place? Now there's food, but there's nothing else she had. She would have agonised over that so much. And now, having lost her 2 sons, there was no one left to carry on the family name. And that was a huge thing. This was massive for them. Their inheritance in the land would go to someone else. In essence, this was the end for the family. They were being cut off from the land, that promised land, that eternal inheritance that they were given. This would be the end. It would go to someone else. This is where Naomi finds herself. And even if she did have a family member to carry on her name, a kinsman redeemer, who on earth was going to marry Ruth or Naomi, women from Moab? Who in their right mind was going to marry a woman from Moab with all the history that they had? This was truly a helpless position she finds herself in. She's living in a pagan land. She's a widow with 2 Moabitish daughters-in-law, and she's now, for what it seems, lost any possession she ever had in her homeland of Bethlehem. And she feels like her God has forsaken her. We read in the end of verse 13. Right at the end, she says, "It grieveth me much for your sakes," talking to her daughters-in-law, "it grieveth me much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord is gone out against me." And when she returns home at the end of this chapter, she says to those who come out to meet her in verse 20, she says, "Don't call me Naomi." She says, "Don't call me Naomi," which means pleasant. She says, "Don't call me pleasant." She says, "Call me Mara," which means bitter. "For the Almighty hath dealt very bitterly with me." In verse 21, she says, "I went out full, and the Lord hath brought me home again empty. Why then call ye me pleasant, seeing the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me?" Now, when I was looking over this, a few things jumped out when I was reading it. Now, the first one is obviously that Naomi feels that God's hand is actively bringing this bitterness into her life. And she doesn't have the answers as to why. She doesn't know why he's acting or bringing these things into her life. And she feels completely empty. She feels like everything she held dear to her, that God has just like ripped them away from her, just taken them out of her hands. But the other thing that jumped out to me, as you read through this, is that Naomi still sees Yahweh as being sovereign and the one who is in control. If you look at her language, she repeats this, and she was definitely right. Yahweh is sovereign, and he was in control of these events. Nothing in this story seems to happen by chance in the story of Ruth. There's no doubting this. She uses the word Almighty in verse 20 and again in verse 21 when talking about this God who was against her. Yes, she felt bitter, but she didn't at any stage deny that he was there controlling events. She never questioned his sovereignty, and that is one of her greatest attributes, I believe. At the moment, she can't see any light at the end of the tunnel. She can't see any reason why God is doing the things he's doing to her, but she still believes God's in control. The words that Naomi is using is very, very similar to the words that Job used. In fact, it's almost identical. And I think that the scripture is linking these two characters together. If we just look at Job, come over to Job chapter 27. Job 27 and verse 2, we read, "As God liveth, who hath taken away my judgment, and the Almighty, who has vexed my soul. I'll read that again. As God liveth, who hath taken away my judgment, and the Almighty who hath vexed my soul. Now the word vexed in the margin means made my soul bitter. Made my soul bitter. Naomi said, call me Mara. She said, call me bitter, for the Almighty has afflicted me. Job says, the Almighty has made my soul bitter. Both these believers would suffer so much in their lives. So much heartbreak, so much bitterness. But they would not deny God's sovereignty. God was almighty. Job suffered so much at the hand of God that people started to wonder, why doesn't he just forsake God, this God that he follows? When you look at his life, when you look at everything that is happening to him, why doesn't he forsake his God? Why doesn't he turn his back on God? But he never did. And back in Ruth chapter 1, I wonder if those thoughts ever entered Naomi's head. I just wonder if those thoughts entered her head. Am I better off not returning to the land at all? God is against me. I don't have much waiting for me back in Bethlehem. I don't have a land. I don't have anyone to take care of me. Am I better off turning my back on God completely and turning instead to the gods of Moab? Were those things that went through her mind? I just wonder if they did. In John chapter 6, as Jesus was teaching in the synagogues in Capernaum, we read that many of his followers were offended at the way that he taught, the things that he was teaching. And we're told in verse 66, from that time, many of his disciples went back and walked no more with him. Then said Jesus to the 12, he said, will you go away? Will you follow them as well? Will you leave me? And then Simon Peter, John 6 verse 68, uttered these words. He said, Lord, to whom shall we go? Thou hast the words of eternal life. Lord, to whom shall we go? As Naomi is contemplating her next step, I believe that the only place that she knew that she could turn was to her God. Where else could she go? God to her was almighty. God was sovereign. She was not going to abandon her God despite the bitterness that she felt in her heart and in her soul. Now, a key theme throughout this chapter, or Ruth chapter 1, is that of returning. You can go through and you can just highlight all the words that refer to returning or to turning back. It's a clear theme right throughout chapter 1. And the word, I think, is there because this shows really what a key moment this was in her life. This was a key moment for Naomi. She may have felt like the hand of God was against her, but she would return to him. She wasn't going to stay in Moab and desert her God. So in verse 6 and 7 of Ruth 1, we read, Then she arose with her daughters-in-law, that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab how that the Lord had visited his people in giving them bread. Wherefore she went forth out of the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return unto the land of Judah. So here is the first real glimmer of light for Naomi in this darkness that had engulfed her life. The Lord had visited his people. And this really is a turning point. It's where the first little bit of light and the glimmer of lights just start to come in her life. And she starts to see these glimmers of light and she starts to get hope. She starts to become hopeful in how her God's working. And this is the first little one. So Naomi makes the decision to return. And as she starts this journey, she decides that it's time to farewell her 2 daughters-in-law. And it's an incredibly touching and emotional moment. These 3 women had been through so much together. They'd been through so much heartbreak together. They'd experienced that loss together. They would have mourned together. They would have strengthened each other. Imagine the connection that these 3 women would have had, having been through the things that they'd been through. These girls were the only ones there for Naomi when she had no one else left. They were her family. But despite this closeness, Naomi doesn't see a future for them in coming back to Bethlehem. And I believe that this was a very selfless decision that Naomi makes. I think it's incredibly selfless. She would have loved these girls. She wouldn't have wanted to say goodbye to these girls. But she is truly doing what she feels is in the best interest for these young women. So she says to them in verse 8, she says, "Go and return to your home in Moab, and may God deal kindly with you just as you have dealt kindly with the dead and with me." And she asked that God would grant them with husbands who could care for them in their homeland of Moab. That is where their only real hope was in the mind of Naomi. And at the end of verse 9 we read, "Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voice and they wept." This wasn't put on. This wasn't fake. This wasn't for appearances. This was genuine emotion pouring out of these women. But Orpah and Ruth are determined to continue with Naomi. In verse 10 they say, "No, Naomi, surely we will return with thee unto thy people." We want to come with you, Naomi. We want to come to your people. But then Naomi makes what is a very, very logical and convincing argument as to why they are much better off staying in their homeland of Moab. Let's just read the argument that she makes. She says in verse 12, "Turn again, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have an husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have an husband also tonight and should also bear sons, would ye tarry for them till they were grown? Would ye stay for them from having husbands? No, my daughters, for it grieveth me much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord is gone out against me." Naomi says, think about the position that you're in. She says, there is no hope for you back in my homeland. Even if I was to get married tonight and have a son, are you going to wait around until they're old enough so that you can marry them? And here she's referring to the law, which said that if your husband died, then the brother of the husband or relative of the dead husband, it was their responsibility to marry his widow and carry on the seed of his brother and to look after that widow. But Naomi makes it clear that there's no hope of that happening. That's not going to happen. That option's off the table. If they return with her to the land, they had no hope of getting married and having children. Naomi could not see how a widow from Moab had any hope of a prosperous future in her land. What hope could she have? And she's making it clear to these girls that there is nothing she can offer them in their homeland. She had no land. She had no one to provide for them. She had a God whose hand was clearly against her, she believed. There was no logical reason for them to come with her. And that must have been heartbreaking, I think, for Naomi to say this to these girls. But she did it because she believed it was the best thing for them. And in verse 14 we read, "And they lifted up their voice and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clave unto her." Naomi has convinced Orpah to return, but she hasn't convinced Ruth. Here we are really introduced to the most incredible woman, Ruth. In our next class we'll look at her in more detail, but tonight we're just going to look at this inspiring commitment that she makes to Naomi, and it's incredibly inspiring. A commitment that would leave Naomi completely speechless. Ruth knew what she wanted, and Naomi was not going to stop her. Even though logically, Naomi makes a lot of sense in the argument that she makes to these girls. Logically, it seemed there was little hope for a Moab girl who had been widowed in the land of Judah. But it says that Ruth clave unto her. She was not going to lose grip of Naomi. Now let's read her words in verse 16 to 18. "And Ruth said, Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Where thou diest will I die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me. When she saw that she was steadfastly minded to go with her, then she left speaking unto her. What an incredible thing that Ruth says. This is a commitment in every sense to Naomi and to her people and to her God. And Naomi may have been left widowed and without children, but Ruth says, you will always have me. You will always have me. I'm not going anywhere. No matter how convincing your argument is, no matter how hopeless the situation, or you think the situation is back in Israel, I am coming with you. This really is a scene, moment of Ruth's conversion to following God. This is the moment of her conversion. And notice that she does so with no guarantees at all, that she is going to get anything back from this decision that she makes. Now, there are a couple of things to note or notice about what Ruth is saying to Naomi. She's making a commitment to not only stay by Naomi's side, but she's also making a commitment to Yahweh. Even though Naomi has said that this God is against her, his hand is against me, she still does it. Now, was this just blind faith by Ruth? Well, I think it's probably likely, I think if you consider this, that Ruth would have, over the years, come to know a fair bit about God. And she'd been married for 10 years to, I think it was Chilean, I believe. I will stand corrected on that. And therefore, she must have heard plenty about God, this God that they worshipped, the God that had brought this family out of the land of Egypt to the promised land. And she'd heard enough to make this type of commitment. But I think what it also indicates is that Naomi and her sons, they were God-fearing people, because everything that Ruth knew about this God could have only come from Naomi and her boys. That's the only source of any information that she had about this God. And so this commitment that Ruth makes comes off the back of that. And I think it does indicate that this family was a God-fearing family. They wanted to share about this God, to teach these girls about the God of Israel. Now, the other thing to note is how far Ruth's commitment actually goes. Now, on my wedding day, when Steph and I said our vows to each other, we each made a commitment to be loyal to each other through all the ups and downs of life, till death do us part. I think that's what I said anyway. I can't really remember, but I'm pretty sure that was part of it. Till death do us part. It's really common that that's what we say in our wedding vows. But notice what Ruth says to Naomi. She says, where you go, I will go, thy people, my people, your God, my God. But then she says, where thou diest, will I die, and there will I be buried. So Ruth says to Naomi, my commitment to you won't even end when your life ends, Naomi. Once you die, Naomi, even at that point, I'm not going to go and return to my home in Moab. Even at that point when you die, I'm not going to go, pack up and leave. She says, I will stay with your people until I die, and then I will be buried in the same place as you. Isn't that amazing? This was a commitment that was to continue on past death. How incredible this woman Ruth is, this commitment that she makes. Now, verse 18, it says, Naomi, when she saw that she was steadfastly minded to go with her, then she left speaking unto her. So when Naomi sees how steadfast Ruth was, there was no point even trying to make a counter-argument to this girl. She knew, she could see the determination on her face. She was not going to be stopped. She was coming. There's nothing Naomi could have done to stop this girl. Now, if you just turn over to Luke chapter 9, because there's a connection here back to our Lord. Now, verse 9, we read in Luke chapter 9, we read in verse 51, And it came to pass, when the time was come, that he, which is Jesus, should be received up, he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem, and sent messengers before his face, and they went and entered into a village of the Samaritans to make ready for him, and they did not receive him, because his face was as though he would go to Jerusalem. So as Jesus comes to this place, Samaria, the people take one look at his face and they could see something different. There was something different about his face. He had set his face steadfastly to go to Jerusalem. His time had now come, and he would travel to Jerusalem. He would journey to Jerusalem in utter faith and obedience to his God, in utter commitment to his God, with determination. And this look on his face was frightening to people. People said, "Don't come into our place. Don't come." They were scared looking at him, looking at this face. And Ruth, in a similar way, is steadfastly minded, determined to travel to the house of bread in utter faith and obedience and commitment to God and to Naomi. And Naomi sees this determination written all over her face, and she can't even speak to her. She couldn't even utter a word. That steadfastness was written all over her face, and she was silent. Isn't that amazing? There was nothing that she could say that was going to change her mind. Such was her commitment. And so they travelled to Bethlehem together, and as people saw Naomi from afar, it started to cause this stir amongst the people. And they say to one another, "Is this Naomi? Could this be Naomi?" And it gives you the sense that Naomi, she only bore just a slight resemblance to the person who left. And no doubt the strain of the devastation she'd carried in the preceding years in Moab was evident in how she looked. She'd probably aged a lot in that time that she'd been away. And she comes back and people look at her and say, is that Naomi? I can tell it's Naomi, but gee, she looks different. You could see all the tragedies written into her face. And so here is Naomi, who had left with her husband and 2 boys, and she returns with no husband, with no children, and a daughter-in-law from Moab. And she says to the people, don't call me pleasant. She says, "Call me bitter. I left this place full, but I've come back empty." Now put yourself in the shoes of Ruth, who's standing right next to Naomi as she's saying this. Think about Ruth's position. No doubt she is trembling as she enters this land. She's scared, and her head would have been down, her eyes just would have been fixed on the ground. And she's there by Naomi's side, who says that she has come back completely empty. She has returned with nothing. And there is Ruth, standing right next to her. What Naomi didn't realise was that standing right next to her was the most incredible demonstration of the love of God in the form of Ruth from Moab. Standing right next to her was the most incredible demonstration of God's love, the most incredible blessing that God could have given to her. What an incredible God we worship, who works in amazing ways. Naomi feels empty, but she was far from empty. God had not left her empty. And that is a lesson for us to take home. Even when at times we ask where God is in our lives, when maybe we've reached a point of despair, whether that's from our own doing, or maybe it's from misfortune, or maybe it's because of loss that we've recently had. Maybe we've recently lost a loved one. At that moment when we feel empty, God is laying the platform in our lives for the most incredible blessings that will one day be revealed. At that very moment of despair and darkness, God has not forsaken us. He is laying the platform for future glory. The story of Naomi is demonstration of that. All things work together for good to those who love God. Now, in 2 weeks' time, we'll continue the story of these two faithful women, looking more into the life of Ruth as they arrive here in Bethlehem with no home, no food, no one to provide for them, and no apparent future, but how that was going to dramatically change.